what were Aristotle's conceptions? And again, this is not only Aristotle, it's basically all of Western civilization. When we look at the sky at night, we see all kinds of lights. We see a little bit of motion, we see some lights moving faster, some lights moving more slowly. People painstakingly recorded all these lights and all the motions, and they eventually were able to discriminate between, of course, the moon and the sun, which seem very close, they're very large, and we have clear motion, and we can decipher the motion as perhaps some kind of circular motion of one about the other. Of course, there was great debate whether it's the Earth that goes around the sun goes around the Earth. And the other lights, the smaller lights, which seem much further away, and moved less radically, but did move throughout a certain period of time. The idea was that anything that wasn't on the planet Earth was some kind of spiritual body. Earth was earthly, and everything else was the heavens. Why did these objects move across the sky? Either because God ordained it so, or because they were spiritual entities in themselves, and they wanted to obey the will of God, and therefore they decided that they were going to move in perfect geometrical shapes, namely generally circles, around the Earth, which was the center of the universe. This conception, together with the idea of the universe being infinite in time and infinite in space, was maybe a distillation of the general ideas of cosmology at that time. Basically, there were several conundrums. If someone would tell you the universe is finite, after thinking about it just for a very short time, you would realize that there's something impossible about that. If you go out to the end of the universe, and someone says, there's a sign here, the universe ends here, you say, well, okay, I'll put my fingers through the sign, and what's on the other side? It can't be that the universe ends somewhere, because there's got to be even an emptiness, something out there, and we'll define all the emptiness, whatever there is, as part of the universe. So we obviously haven't gotten to the end of the universe. So it must be that the universe is endless, it's infinite. People applied similar kinds of reasoning to determine that the universe is also eternal. In other words, it always had existed, and always would exist. Even those people, philosophers, who ascribe to the belief that there is a ground of being, a deity of God, some kind of a creator, whatever it may be, generally speaking, that kind of creator would be eternal. And in their conception, an eternal being would never change its mind, wouldn't come up with a new idea. Its ideas would also be eternal. If it had once wanted to have a universe exist, it would always have wanted a universe to exist, and therefore a universe would always have existed. And therefore it would always exist. So they had this conception of a universe which, in time and in space, was infinite, backwards and forwards. Many, many years later, over 1,000 years later, Rambam, Maimonides, of course, the great Jewish sage and philosopher, was grappling with this philosophy. And he wrote a book, The Guide of the Perplexed, and he basically accepted the views of Aristotle about the universe, with one exception: the idea that the universe always had existed. He said we have Genesis. Genesis tells us about a creation in time. The universe, in other words, exists now, and it has existed only for a certain finite amount of time, not forever. And therefore, I'm going to look at Aristotle's theory and see if there's any holes in it. He analyzed it very carefully, and he set out his position in the Guide of the Perplexed to show why he felt that Aristotle's views were not rock solid. And therefore, one didn't have to be anti-philosophy. One could just say, well, philosophically speaking, we don't ascribe to his views. Rambam also clearly states that had Aristotle's views been more convincing, had they been irrefutable, he himself would have accepted it, and he would have expected any reasonable person to accept the idea that the universe always had existed. At the time of the Greeks, they had never thought even to test any of their speculations. To the Greeks, it was obvious, to the philosophers, however ingenious they were, that two objects which weigh different amounts will fall at different speeds. Obviously, something that's heavier falls faster. I mean, that's obvious to everyone, but it's not true. And any simple demonstration will show that it's not true. We've all heard the story about the Leaning Tower of Pisa and so on, and dropping things off. Whether or not that's actually history, anyone contrive, you drop two things, one very heavy and one light, and they'll hit the ground at the same time. Of course, if it's a piece of paper that flutters in the air or something like that, it's a different story. But if you take a small coin and a heavy rock, basically they fall the same. If you drop them, they'll hit the ground at the same time. They never even thought to try an experiment like that. Their mode of coming to an understanding of what the universe was like was more metaphysical, philosophical, rather than what we know as the scientific method. Trying things out, making a theory, coming up with a prediction based on that theory, and then designing an experiment to measure whether or not the prediction is correct. And if it isn't, rejecting that theory. There always were discussions and arguments and differences of opinion between philosophers of any given period of time and the religious conception of the creation of the universe as we have it in Genesis. Even though perhaps Noah had a tradition as to how the universe was created, right around the time of his death and soon thereafter, the world was basically pagan. It was the time of Abraham, which we're studying right now in the portion of the week. And we can certainly visualize Abraham conducting all these kind of learned discussions with the metaphysicians and philosophers of his time. And we do have, in fact, records of the ancient Near East. We know what were the conceptions of the creation in ancient Babylonia and etc. And they are certainly not exactly the same as Genesis. So clearly there always were these differences between what the rest of the world conceived of how the universe came into being or why it came into being, and what the Torah teaches. It's not something new. 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years later, the Greeks began to originate their very fascinating ideas of how the universe originated, if it originated at all. And back then there were discussions between Jewish philosophers and Greeks, and some of these are recorded in the Talmud. So again, this is something that one can trace all the way back. It's not a new issue. I would say it never was an issue. And at the time of the ancient Greeks, there was not yet the scientific approach, the scientific method had not yet been developed. And people tried to come to truths about the universe, about the meaning of the universe and life, through independent thinking rather than through experiment. The philosophy that gained most credence was that of Aristotle, eventually prevailed. And that was that the universe as a whole is eternal in time and infinite in extent. It goes on and on in any direction forever. And it always existed and always will exist. They had what they felt to be very, very good reason to come up with this idea. And there were other conceptions that the universe may have begun to exist at some point in the past. But eventually the force of Aristotle's arguments defeated all the opposition. And for over 1,000 years, philosophers and people who today maybe we would call scientists accepted this version of the origin of the universe. Part of it had to do with logical thinking. If someone were to tell you that the universe is not infinite in extent, then you would say, well, then the universe must come to an end somewhere. If it comes to an end, well, what is there at the end, and what is beyond the end? Can I stick my fingers out after the end of the universe, and then what's there? By definition, if I can put my hand out, then the universe didn't end, because I define universe as everything that there is. So it seemed totally impossible to think of a universe that was finite in extent. It had to be infinite. And for philosophical reasons, it seemed almost impossible to imagine a universe that came into being at a certain point in time, because what was before that time? And even according to the metaphysical speculations, which in that time was considered philosophy, if one imagined that the universe existed because of the existence of some kind of supreme being, or the ground of being, as perhaps maybe philosophers would have put it then, if that entity was eternal, then that entity probably does not change its mind and have whims and sudden desires and fancies. And therefore, if it desired that there be a universe, it would always have desired that there would be a universe, and therefore there always would have been a universe. And therefore there would always be a universe. So the universe of necessity, even to those whose conception of the universe included some kind of metaphysical entity, a ground of being, necessarily concluded that the universe was eternal. And this conception continued on for over 1,000 years up until medieval times. And about 800 years ago, the great philosopher and sage Maimonides, Rambam, wrote an entire work, The Guide to the Perplexed, whose basic fundamental thread running through the text was to talk about what today would be considered science and religion. At that time it was maybe more philosophy, metaphysics, and religion. And Rambam's main point in the book was that although Aristotle's arguments were convincing to some degree, they were not logically totally convincing enough that we should reject an idea like the creation of the universe as a result. What he did say very clearly was that if Aristotle's arguments would have been more cogent and would have been entirely logical and irrefutable, then there would be no religious necessity to reject them. There would be no religious necessity to understand Genesis as implying that the universe came into being at a certain time. In other words, in line with Maimonides' general position that there is much in the Torah that should be understood in an allegorical method, not to dismiss any of the commandments and so on, but certain of the more philosophical statements about the nature of God and so on should be understood allegorically. He said that it's certainly possible that Genesis is also meant allegorically. In fact, he mentions explicitly many things in Genesis that are allegorical. And one need not consider this to be a fundamental tenet of Judaism that must hold in the face of any kind of convincing evidence. I'm quite sure that had he lived now, he would analyze the Big Bang Theory and any other kind of scientific conception, and he would come to his conclusions, whatever they would be, whether or not they were convincing or not convincing, and come to a determination in that respect. The Torah is based on revelation. God reveals truths to mankind, and then man passes it on through tradition. Science works exactly in the opposite way. In the way that perhaps Descartes began modern philosophy and said, I'm going to disbelieve everything, I'm going to mistrust everything, I'm going to doubt everything, and he started from that point. What can I know without relying on something that someone else told me? Of course, he very quickly strayed from that path and came up with a whole philosophy that is not necessarily based on fundamental truths, but he did begin a trailblazer in that way. Modern science works in a similar method and says, tradition is very nice, revelation is very nice, I want to know what can I know about the universe based on my own explorations, my own thinking, and that I can verify through experiment, and that everyone will agree upon whether they are a Satmar Chassid who happens to be a physicist or they're a Chinese communist who happens to be a physicist, they will agree on these results. And that's really something quite beautiful. Now, there are many kinds of truths that people will not agree about. Clearly, religious truths, political philosophies, and so on, they're not going to agree with. But science limits itself to those things which can be independently and objectively and universally verified by people independent of their religion, political philosophy, and so on. And as such, I think it's actually a very noble pursuit. However, it does, of necessity, limit you, and it, of necessity, denies information that comes from other kinds of sources. Now, the truth view of creation, the idea that the universe began and that it has a creator, some entity which designed the universe, planned it, decided that it should come to being, rather than it either always existed or had to come to being, was always a radical concept. It's a radical concept even today. It's a radical concept when we look at the ancient times, the ancient pagan philosophers, the people before them in Babylonia and Egypt. Avraham Avinu, which we're coming to, was engaged in philosophical dialogue with his
contemporaries, and he was a very brilliant man. And he, I'm sure, had many conversations and dialogues and arguments with the great philosophers of his time. Jews always lived in the metropolitan centers. At the time of Abraham, they lived in Babylonia, which was the center of world culture. A few generations later, we were in Egypt, which was the center of world culture. A little bit later, the Greeks came to us, and the Greek world and Greek philosophy was really the beginning of modern philosophy and modern science. After that, the Romans. And today, in the United States. So we were always in the middle of every major civilization. And just like Jews today are very strongly involved one way or another, intellectually, scientifically, with the outside world, I think it's pretty safe to assume that we were that much engaged all throughout our history. We know that 800 years ago or so, Rambam certainly was. When you read the Gemara, you see that 2,000 years ago, Chazal in Babel and in Yerushalayim were very heavily engaged and had dialogues that are recorded in the Gemara. And although we don't have clearly recorded dialogues from Shlomo Melech, if you read through his books, you can see that clearly he was addressing issues of philosophical and what would be considered at that time scientific importance. So this idea that the universe was designed, was created for a purpose, something that maybe we as Jews can take credit for, introducing it, arguing with the pagans, and that has been a confrontation that has continued to this day. Is the universe eternal? Did it exist just because it exists? Is it something that has no cause? After about the period of the Middle Ages, you have Rambam writing the Guide to the Perplexed. I don't know if you've studied it in any classes. The major part of that book was meant to counter Aristotle's view that the universe is eternal. The idea being that if there was some kind of eternal entity, God, and that entity decided at some time to create the universe, since it was eternal, it never would have not decided that. It would have never changed its mind. And therefore, even if there was an entity that had caused the universe to come into being, that universe always would have existed. So the idea, again, not only of a design of the universe, but of the universe coming into being at some finite time ago, was a distinctly Jewish concept and was always subject to critique. People think that nowadays, suddenly with Big Bang theory, there's a conflict between science and religion. There always was this conflict, just that the sides changed. Once people believed in an eternal universe, and they believed in a random universe, they believed the scientific and philosophical viewpoints shifted. Our viewpoint has always been consistent. The approach of philosophy and science and religion to obtaining knowledge is somewhat different. Religion believes in some kind of a connection, revelation. Science believes in rejecting any kind of information that is not independently verified, that's not objective. Science deals only with those things, as you well know, which a scientist who is a Satmar Chassid living in Brooklyn can agree with a Chinese communist scientist. Those things on which they don't agree essentially aren't really science. They may be philosophy, they may be religion, they may be poetry, they may be all kinds of things, politics. Those things which people can agree on, people can make predictions, measure, that's what science deals with. So science deliberately limits itself and excludes from its purview many things that are very important to us. Meaning, purpose, life, love, whatever. All those things aren't dealt with by science. And in a way that's to the credit of science. Science knows how to limit itself only to those things which it can measure and prove. That doesn't mean that science also claims that those things that cannot be measured or proved to exist don't exist or aren't important. And that distinction has to be kept in mind all the time. And that is important in application also to religion in general. Science does not deal with things that cannot be measured, and therefore if there is a God who is not a material being and doesn't take up space, then there's no physical kind of measurement that will take that. And therefore science doesn't deal with it. Science doesn't say such a being can't exist. It says within the scientific definition of existence, we deal only with those things that can be measured and objective. So since this is not in that category, it's not a scientifically existing entity, which is very different than saying this is an entity that science says does not exist. Okay? So again, it's a very, very important distinction. Again, also, If you're talking about the purpose of the universe, I'm talking about what caused the universe to emerge into existence. Again, science doesn't deal with that if it's not something that leads to a prediction that can be verified. Okay? If science claims that the universe emerged at a certain time, one can equally well claim that the universe emerged by itself, or the universe emerged as a result of some entity design. Without that contradictory design, without that being in any way impinging on something. Because science will not talk about things that are beyond what the equations can get. Now, on the other hand, within the categories of science, the models that have been arrived at are consistent. In other words, it's not that science will say, well, we don't know what caused the universe, and therefore there's a big empty hole in our approach, and therefore one needs to go to religion. From within the scientific viewpoint, it's sufficient to explain basically what has been explained. And I'll give you a little bit of an example. If you are looking at a set of points, like a mathematical set, and if you have, let's say, the set is not closed on either end, then basically there can be an infinite amount of points off to the left or off to the right. And you can go on and on and on in an infinite, let's say, set of integers with the positive and the minus integers going off to the left and to the right, and you'll never get to an end. And you'll never get to an end on this side. Right? Now, we know that there's something outside it. It's on a piece of paper, it's written, there are other sets, and so on. From within the set, there's no way to get out of the set. If you can design a system from within which there is no outside, then it's kind of consistent in itself. And that's the system that science is striving to come to. Some system within which it is self-consistent. Human beings, when confronted with that system, might not feel satisfied to say, oh, well, that answers all my questions. Our psychology is such that when we're confronted with such a thing, we say, yes, but what brought that into being? But that question is not necessarily something that science considers legitimate in the sense of science. It can be considered totally legitimate by scientists for the types of questions that human beings find very important. Now, the origin of the whole idea of the Big Bang Theory starts with human beings looking at the universe and trying to figure out what is it made of, how large is it, when did it begin, why is it here? And again, that has always been the case. Probably as long as we've been able to think and see, and as long as there have been people who wonder about deep questions, people have looked up and seen the stars and wondered what they are, and how you get there, and does somebody live there, and so on. And in ancient times, the approach, for example, of Aristotle was more metaphysical, philosophical. In modern times, we have a somewhat different approach. We have science, which attempts to come up with equations that can be proven rather than speculations.